In the early 1920s, a German family and their new maid were found dead in their home. Despite efforts from law enforcement, the case still remains unsolved today, almost a century later. It is one of Germany's oldest and eeriest unsolved murders. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the unsolved case of the Hinterkaifeck murders. The Hinterkaifeck homestead was located near the woods about an hour's drive from München. The homestead was home to 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel, her two children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, as well as her elderly parents Andreas and Cecilia Gruber. The house was also home to the family's new housekeeper, Maria Baumgartner. Prior to the murders, a series of weird events had occurred. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas Gruber had told a neighbor that he had noticed footprints in the snow leading from the woods behind the farm pointing towards the home, but none leading away from it. He had also complained to neighbors that he had heard footsteps in the attic. He also noticed that several keys were missing. Gruber also told neighbors that he found a newspaper in his home that he hadn't purchased. The housekeeper, Maria Baumgartner, had only recently started her job. The night she was murdered was actually her first night working as a maid on the farm. This was because the previous housekeeper had quit roughly 6 months prior. The previous maid believed that the house was haunted because she had often heard unexplained noises and voices in the attic. All of these occurrences led police to believe that the murderer or murderers were already living in the home for more than 6 months prior to the attack. The family were known for keeping to themselves. So when young Cecilia missed school and the family didn't show up to church, the neighbors didn't really worry as they had seen chimney smoke wafting from the farmhouse. On April 1st, 2 coffee sellers arrived at Hinterkaifeck to place an order. They knocked on the door and the windows but got no answer. After checking around the yard and finding no one, they decided to leave. On April 3rd, the postman noticed that Saturday's mail was still where he had left it. On April 4th, a repairman named Albert Hofner arrived to repair the engine of the food chopper. He later stated that he had not seen the family at all, but that he had heard the sound of farm animals and a dog inside the barn. After waiting an hour to see if anyone would show up, he started the repair, which took roughly 4.5 hours. Upon completion, Hofner left, having not seen any of the residents of the homestead. After 4 days had passed with Cecilia missing school, the mail beginning to pile up at the post office, and no one having seen or heard anything from the family, the neighbors decided to go to the homestead and check on them. They made a gruesome discovery. In the barn, they found 4 brutally battered bodies covered with hay. The bodies of 2-year-old Joseph and the maid Maria were found inside the house. Police were immediately notified, and they began conducting an investigation of the murders. When the bodies of the family were sent for autopsies, their heads were removed and sent to clairvoyants in München to unearth metaphysical clues. The clairvoyants were unsuccessful, and during the chaos caused by World War II, the heads of the family ended up missing. The headless bodies of the family and their maid Maria were buried in a cemetery in a nearby town. When the autopsy of the bodies was done, it painted a horrifying image of the fate that befell the family. The elderly Cecilia showed signs of strangulation, and her skull was cracked due to receiving 7 blows to the head. Her husband, Andreas, had his face completely covered in blood, with his cheekbones being visible. Victoria's head showed 9 star-shaped wounds, and the right side of her face had been hit with a blunt object. The younger Cecilia's lower jaw had been shattered, and her face was covered in gaping circular wounds. She had a neck injury that may have been a slit throat or simply a tear from a sharp bludgeoning weapon. While the adults most likely died instantly from the blows, there were evidence that the little girl likely had been alive for several hours after the attack. She was missing clumps of her hair, which investigators believed that she had pulled out herself. It's believed that she might have spent hours lying next to her dead family before succumbing to her injuries. Inside the farmhouse, the housekeeper Maria and the little boy Joseph had met an equally gruesome fate. Maria had been killed by crosswise blows to the head in her chambers, and Joseph was killed by a heavy blow to the face in his cot in Victoria's room. The bodies in the barn were stacked on top of each other and then covered with hay, while Maria had been covered with bedclothes and Joseph had been covered with one of his mother's dresses. The murder weapon was originally not found. It wasn't until 1923, when Hinterkaifeck was demolished, that someone found a secret cavity under the attic floorboards. Hidden there was a bloody mattock and a penknife. Initially, it was believed that the main motive was robbery. Traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and several inhabitants from the surrounding villages were interrogated by the investigators. But this theory was eventually abandoned. Due to neighbors seeing smoke from the chimney, it is believed that the killers had remained on the farm for several days after the crime. The animals on the farm and the family's dog were unharmed, and investigators even found that chores such as feeding the animals and milking the cow had been taken care of. Despite no clear motive, the police began compiling a list of suspects. Many suspects were arrested over the years, but no one was ever charged with the crime. The case files were closed in 1955, but despite this, the last interrogation took place in 1986. More than 100 suspects were questioned, ranging from family members and ex-lovers to known robbers and murderers. The case became so notorious that many people were accused of being the killer, and the investigators were left with hearsay evidence and village gossip. None of the interrogations yielded any conclusive results of what happened that night at Hinterkaifeck. Strange clues had been found in the attic. There were signs that 1 or possibly 2 people had been sleeping in the hay. Some of the hay had even been scattered all over the floorboards, as if to deaden footsteps. However, opinion is divided on whether or not this was the killer in hiding or a place where Gruber brought Victoria from time to time. Allegedly, it was no secret among the farm's neighbors that from the time that Victoria was 16, she had been raped by her father. Reportedly, they had even been arrested for incest in 1915 after having been caught by a servant. Victoria ended up serving 1 month while Gruber was sent away for a year. After the murders, this led to speculation such as the noises being heard in the attic was that of Gruber and Victoria. It was also rumored that Gruber was the father of Joseph and possibly young Cecilia as well. It was even believed that Victoria's marriage to Carl Gabriel was an attempt to get away from her father. Though more clues would eventually be found that pointed to the attic being a hiding place for the killer, such as the discovery of a rope tied to a crossbeam and next to a window, and on the roof several broken or moved tiles could be observed. The biggest suspect in the case was the neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Rumors stated that he was the father of young Joseph. Allegedly, Victoria herself had insisted that he was the father, But Schlittenbauer had instead claimed that the pregnancy was the result of continued between Victoria and Andreas. He even went so far as to report them to the courts, but he eventually retracted this accusation, saying that it was merely a fabrication. Another rumor stated that Schlittenbauer had proposed to Victoria, but that the marriage had been opposed by Gruber. Schlittenbauer was the one who found the bodies, and his statement to police had become a primary source for what happened at the farm on that Tuesday afternoon. Allegedly, when he and others first arrived at the homestead to investigate, they had to break a gate to enter the barn because all of the doors were locked. After finding the bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer had unlocked the front door with a key and entered the house alone. Many viewed this as suspicious due to the fact that Gruber had complained that keys had gone missing, though it is possible that Schlittenbauer had simply been given a key by Victoria. According to one of the men who came with him to investigate the homestead, Jakob Siegel, Schlittenbauer had shouted, "Where is my little boy?" while searching the homestead. It is known that Schlittenbauer had disturbed the bodies at the scene by moving them, which could have compromised the investigation further. For many, Schlittenbauer was the one responsible for the murders. His behavior after finding the bodies and his strange comments for years after led people to believe that he was the one responsible. Siegel and the other man who came with him to the homestead, Michael Paul, were reportedly uncomfortable with how he had acted around the dead bodies and how he had entered the farmhouse, seemingly without any worry that the killer might still be there. Schlittenbauer thus appeared to have a clear motive. However, there is evidence that the killer remained on the farm for days after the killings. Schlittenbauer was well known in the area, and him remaining on the property for days after the murders would be a huge risk to take. No one had seen him near the crime scene in the days following the murders. Lorenz Schlittenbauer passed away in 1941. While he appears to be the most likely suspect due to the amount of information on him, he wasn't the only suspect. The former maid of Hinterkaifeck suspected the brothers Anton and Karl Bischler to have been the ones who committed the murders. Anton had helped with the potato harvest and he knew the premises. The family's dog, who barked at everyone, allegedly never barked at Anton Bischler. However, both Karl and Anton had strong alibis and they were both released after being arrested and interrogated. It was even theorized that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had returned home and flew into a rage upon seeing that she had had a son with another man, causing him to murder the entire family as revenge. However, soldiers from his regiment attested to him being killed in action during World War I, some even stating that they had seen his dead body with their own eyes. Despite this theory gained a lot of traction due to the fact that Gabriel's body was never found, and reports kept coming in from people claiming to have met Gabriel or that they could confirm that he had switched his identity with that of another fallen soldier. One question that investigators tried to answer was why the victims had gone to the barn in the first place. It was theorized that the victims had likely been lured to the barn one by one, but the question was how. Tests conducted by the police found that yelling from the barn could not be heard from the living quarters, which could explain how the family members were killed one by one without anyone noticing. But it didn't explain how the family members were lured to the barn in the first place. The order of death also couldn't be determined from the way the bodies were piled, as Schlittenbauer disturbed the order as soon as they were found. And there was no telling if the killer had piled the bodies up after all had died, or if it was done as they died one by one. The investigation had also been hampered by the fact that many people interacted with the crime scene, such as Schlittenbauer moving the bodies, Various items had also been moved around, and some people had even cooked and eaten meals in the kitchen. And the police had failed to conduct interrogations immediately after the crime, which meant that some of the people who had been on the homestead weren't questioned until years later. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become one of the most notorious unsolved true crimes in Germany's history, due in part to the unclear and somewhat confusing details of the case. There are many theories regarding this case, but a lot of it is based on hearsay and village gossip. While some people might seem stronger suspects than others, there were plenty of people within the list of 100 that also appeared to have a good motive. Almost 100 years have passed since the murders at Hinterkaifeck, and it seems unlikely that the case will ever be solved. But perhaps future technology will allow for some answers.